April 22, 1992, just a few days after Easter, the deeply religious city of Guadalajara would experience its own version of the Holocaust. What started with multiple gasoline explosions on that fateful Wednesday would climax in an inferno a la Dante, reducing the once boisterous Analco district of Jalisco, Mexico, to mere rubble in less than a day. As the volunteers dig through the rubble to salvage what they can, fingers would be pointed and shocking confessions would be made. But far more importantly, hundreds of lives would be lost, including children. Hundreds more would go missing forever, and thousands would be displaced. This is the unnerving disaster that was the 1992 Guadalajara explosions. Guadalajara is not a city you hear about often, and that's only because it's a silent achiever. The city is actually the epicenter of Mexican culture, arts, business, technology, and tourism. It also ranks among the 100 most productive and globally competitive cities in the world today. Throughout the 20th century, Guadalajara attracted lots of investments from big-time companies, which resulted in the growth of the city's economy to the point where it became the second largest in Mexico, behind Mexico City. Automatically, the living standards of Guadalajara's residents started to improve, as lower-class citizens rose to middle-class and upper-middle class. But little did anyone know that all of this was about to go up in flames. Literally. By 1992, Guadalajara was in a celebratory mood. February of that year had made it to the 450th year since the city was founded at the margins of the San Juan River in the Atemajac Valley, and spirits were high. But it took barely 2 months for any trace of joy to evaporate from the city, never to be restored again for a long time. April 19th, 1992 started out like every other day. But it wasn't long before people in Dante Street began to perceive that something wasn't right. Why were their eyes suddenly watering, they wondered? Why did they feel this sting in their throats? And what was this nauseating smell? The answer, as it turned out, was gasoline. Worried, the people of Dante Street started to reach out to the Guadalajara Fire Department, begging them to come and investigate what was going on in their neighborhood. The Guadalajara Fire Department and the Intermunicipal Water and Sewer System, SIAPA, showed up on Tuesday, April 21st, to begin a 48-hour investigation. Their findings confirmed what the residents of Dante Street already suspected. There were high levels of gasoline and other hydrocarbons in the street's sewer systems. The tension in the air was palpable as word hit the streets about how the city was literally sitting on top of a seething underground liquid inferno waiting to happen. Radio programs and local newspapers would carry stories about these odors as well, because this was beginning to get blood-curdlingly reminiscent. The government, though, would beg to differ. Upon examination of Dante's sewer system, it was found that water samples, though clear, had a solvent odor. Further analysis would later reveal that the water had concentrations of a liquid suspected to be hexane, with up to 100% explosivity. In simpler terms, all it took now was the tiniest spark from the butt of a cigarette smoked by a random individual walking along the street to set off a modern-day holocaust. At such levels, the only appropriate response is for everyone to leave the area with immediate effect. But the government felt that the situation could be managed, and so it failed to give the order for people to evacuate the city. Firefighters were instead instructed to open manhole covers to allow some gas escape. They were also to flush out the alleged hexane into a river that flowed outside of Guadalajara by pumping gallons of water into the city's sewer pipes. By 3:30 a.m. on April 22, 1992, after hours of work at the Dante sewers, the explosivity in the water had declined from 100% to 15%. The firefighters could now go to bed and once again reassure the residents of Dante Street that all was well, but many still could not shake off the feeling that something disastrous was looming, and barely 5 hours later, their suspicions were confirmed. Residents of Guadalajara say that it was around 10 a.m. on April 22nd that they started to notice the manhole covers in the streets bouncing, with smoke seeping out from under them. In fact, many were finding gasoline in their toilets and water pipes, yet officials continued to repeat that everything was under control. What the residents didn't know, but would find out later through the help of investigative journalism, was that just an hour before, while firefighters and the SIAPA officials reassured them that all was fine, the SIAP director at the time had been in a meeting with then Jalisco State Governor Guillermo Cosio Vidaurri. When the director appeared before the governor, it was obvious he brought bad news, as he couldn't hide his nervousness. Sewer explosivity levels were back to 100%. The city was in danger. The words had barely left the director's mouth when the first twin explosions tore through Dante and its environs in rapid succession. Blast after cataclysmic blast, multiple city blocks were instantly being reduced into gaping ravines that swallowed more than 200,000 tons of rubble. The cars and buses that had the misfortune of plying that road at the time of the blasts were flung through the air like toy vehicles and tossed onto nearby rooftops where they crash-landed. Rivers of sewage flowed everywhere as uprooted trees dotted the now excavated roads. Collapsed houses, which were now little less than twisted metal and granulated blocks, featured shoes and clothing whose owners would probably never be needing them again. Survivors recall looking out into the streets and seeing a rapidly disintegrating landscape accelerating towards them, accompanied by a deafening hissing sound. They were the lucky ones, it turns out, as they were able to jump out of the center of the street just in time. The others, though, not so much. Unfortunately, a good percentage of the casualties would be school children, spending the Easter break playing with their friends in the street. Measuring the full extent of the havoc the disaster wreaked took about a week because of the sheer extent. By the time the figures came in, it was awful. About 1,500 people had been injured, over 1,000 buildings, 350 businesses, and 500 vehicles were destroyed, and about 25,000 people had been displaced. A few key statistics, though, would remain contested to this day. For instance, some say there were 10 explosions while others say 9, and some even say 7 or 15. The death toll numbers are even more varied. Although many figures stay within the environs of 200, many locals would argue that the numbers were much higher, probably even close to 1,000. This figure would never officially be confirmed, but whatever the actual number, it probably would have been a lot higher save for the immediate response of surviving neighbors at Dante Street. The 1992 Guadalajara explosion might have been one of the most cataclysmic disasters to ever happen to mankind, but it did allow for the display of one of the most heart-moving scenes of human kindness ever seen in real life. In an interview conducted by a journalist, Benigno Aguirre, it was revealed that most of the people rescued alive from the craters created by the blast at Dante were rescued by volunteer neighbors. The cooperation and coordination was second to none as volunteers shared information, bravely dug through the rubble, and transported victims in their personal cars to the hospital to receive treatment. The government soon showed up too, with soldiers to keep the peace and rescue workers accompanied by trained dogs to rescue others who were still trapped. Governor Guillermo Cosio Vidaurri ordered for the now displaced residents to be housed at the State University in 2 sports stadiums. Meanwhile, hospitals were overflowing with bodies, and so gymnasiums had to be converted into makeshift morgues. Whenever catastrophes like this happen, people naturally look for a scapegoat, and the people of Guadalajara already had theirs. Pemex, the state-owned oil company, and the wealthiest entity in Mexico at the time. Between 1979 and 1991, Mexico had suffered 4 explosions, with one even causing a death toll of 500. Each one of these explosions was linked to gasoline leakage from Pemex facilities into sewer pipes, and in each of these cases, not once did Pemex take responsibility, nor was the company ever held accountable. Following this grim story, it wasn't difficult for people to point the finger at Pemex once again. However, in a show of righteous indignation, Pemex declared that it had no hand in the disaster, shifting the blame to a smaller cooking oil facility called La Central instead. According to the story, Pemex touted hexane must have seeped into Guadalajara's sewers from La Central's drainage system. But this story would turn out to be false, as chemical engineers were unanimous in their conclusion that it would take hundreds of thousands of liters of hexane to cause the magnitude of explosion witnessed at Dante. La Central, on the other hand, barely handled about 3,000 liters of hexane a day and had a max storage capacity of 60,000 liters. The biggest evidence absolving La Central, though, was the fact that its hexane tank was still full after the explosion. Plus, La Central factory was still intact after the blasts. If indeed La Central was the source of the leak, its factory would have been the first place to explode. Meanwhile, Pemex, who had been declaring its own innocence, would announce the detection of a leak in one of its gasoline pipelines on April 23, 1992. Its explanation, however, would be that the explosion had caused the pipeline to burst and leak, and not the other way around. By the next day, word had gotten out that the underground soil at Pemex's facility at La Nogalera, an area close to the site of the Guadalajara explosion, was soaked in a 3-feet-deep blanket of fuel covering a distance of 16 square blocks. When federal congressmen were sent to assess the situation, they were denied entry into La Nogalera, confirming the voices of critics who lamented that Pemex acted like a state within a state. Pemex workers were also prohibited from speaking about the situation to outsiders, while the company donated 40 million pesos to the Association of April 22nd of Guadalajara. All of these factors only served to make Pemex look guiltier. And in fact, 4 Pemex officials were eventually arrested for negligence, even though they'd eventually be cleared of all charges. In all of this, the main question in the heart of everyone had still not been answered. What exactly caused the explosion? As it turned out, the answer was twofold. On one hand, several years before the explosion, a contractor had installed zinc-coated iron water pipes for the city. Unfortunately, these pipes were too close to an existing steel gas line. Thanks to underground humidity, the materials of both pipes reacted, which caused the steel gas pipe to corrode, creating a hole from which gasoline leaked and made its way into the main sewer pipe. However, this could still have been averted with the sewer pipe not being remodeled into a U-shape in a bid to expand the city's underground railway system. Typically, when sewer pipes are constructed, engineers build into a slope. This way, gravity does most of the work of moving the waste. But now that the pipe was U-shaped, the engineers had to create artificial gravity by inserting an inverted siphon. The problem is, inverted siphons work best when the fluids are uniform. But the authorities had not anticipated a gas leak, so they couldn't have imagined that the inverted siphon would be a problem. Unfortunately, the leak happened, and so the sewer pipes were transporting liquids of different densities as a result. In this underground world, the densest have the right of passage. Being heavier than gasoline, therefore, water passes through the siphon, leaving gasoline trapped upstream. Over time, the gasoline would continue to accumulate upstream, and so on that fateful day of April 22, 1992, as the scorching sun reached its full strength, it caused the accumulated gasoline to evaporate into the explosive vapors that residents of Dante saw escaping from the manhole covers. The city's sewer lines had become a ticking time bomb, and the investigators say that attempts by the water authority to investigate the smell may have triggered the blasts. On that day, workmen were at work across the city lifting manhole covers to release fumes from the sewer. Metal struck by metal can cause a spark. Perhaps a workman jamming a crowbar into a manhole cover or dropping a cover back onto the hole created that fatal spark. Today, one would hardly recognize that an explosion of such epic proportions ever happened at Guadalajara, as modern architecture has replaced the ruins. Still, in the hearts of survivors who witnessed that black day, the wounds are still as fresh as though it happened this morning.